from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome you to a two-part series about the oral literature of the Indian peoples of the Northwest. We're happy to have the editor of this book with us, and we're going to talk in two sections about it. The book is entitled Stories That Make the World, the subtitle Oral Literature of the Indian Peoples of the Inland Northwest, and I have a copy of the book right here with me. And we welcome to the program its editor, Dr. Rodney Fry, who holds a doctor's degree in anthropology, and he certainly has a very, very impressive background with Indian tribes, and particularly a book he wrote on the Crow tribe. He also serves as the director in Coeur d'Alene of extended programs for Lewis and Clark State College from Lewiston, Idaho. Dr. Fry has been with us before on other programs we've done about other books he's written, and it's a pleasure to have you back, Rodney, to engage in this two-week series. We're very excited, and I will tell our viewers that in the program today we want to talk about how you put a book like this together, and I know this one has some very interesting stories about how that happened, and then in program number 2 we're going to come back and have you to share with us the content, and particularly some of the wonderful stories that are told by American Indian storytellers that are very rich, and I know our viewers will enjoy that. Thank you for being on our program.
Well, it's a real honor to be here, Tony and Jeanne.
And I'm very pleased to have as the panel member today, Jeanne Givens. And Jeanne comes to us with a long list of credentials. She is presently serving as vice chair of the North Idaho College Board of Trustees. For you viewers who are not in the Boise area, she does a column for the Idaho Statesman that has been running now for about a year. In addition to that, she's a former member of the Idaho legislature, and she serves on a number of boards and commissions that also address Indian issues nationwide. Jeanne, as always, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for being with us on these two programs.
Thank you, Tony.
At this time, I will ask Jeanne to commence our questioning.
The book is out. What has been the reaction to Stories That Make the World?
Reaction? Yeah, I think it's been quite good. It's selling quite well nationally and internationally. I think the gratifying element, though, comes locally. With all the sales nationally, internationally, that's fine. But when the book itself can claim ownership by the Coeur d'Alenes or the Crows or the Kootenays, that these are their stories and they feel comfortable that this is as good a rendition that can be done in a written format, and they feel comfortable. They can hear the voice of one of the storytellers, Lawrence Arepa, in the reading of this text. That's the greatest gratification. So I think it's doing quite well in that regard. That's the most important criteria for me.
Thank you.
Also, I should have said this when we introduced the program. This is put out by the University of Oklahoma Press and is available in bookstores. Rodney, that you've had the experience now of writing several books, and I think I will announce for Jeanne Givens that she says that she may be writing a book in the near future. There's certainly a great challenge to doing that. Your other books are on other subjects. One was on the Crow tribe, and you wrote one on the development and historical questions about values. I guess I'll start with a very general question, not just about this book, but for those budding writers out there who are very interested in this, what is included in getting together the idea of a content of a book, and how you, in this case where you're working with lots of other people, kind of take us through the preparation even before the book is written.
I think there's a lot of listening that has to be done. You really have to listen within yourself and those around you. For me, in my writing process, the book is already there. It's a matter of letting it come forth. I felt very strongly about that in all cases. This book was already out here. It had to be listened to. We had to listen to the elders, the cultural committees, all the many people involved with helping bring this together, listening. And once we were able to listen, able to connect in that sort of fashion, truly their voices could come through. No matter where the source is, something fictional writing, for example, maybe the voice comes from within inside you. Or in this case, the voice came from many, many other people. And this, in fact, is a collective endeavor, the result of many, many people's participation. And this is much Lawrence Arepa's book, as Tom Yellowtail's, as Basil White's, as Maury Waters, and all the other elders that helped make this. This is listening to them. And assembling that and working with that. I remember when I first received the idea of putting this book together, in this case, and I think in all writing endeavors, there's a need for that listening and sensitivity to your subject matter, and treating it with respect and life, that it's not to be carelessly put together. And I remember working real closely with the Coeur d'Alene's, their cultural committee initially, and it wasn't simply a matter of going and talking with one of the elders and collecting stories. It was very critical that you learn the context first. You learn the heartbeat of the people first. You know the context. That's critical. It's a very time-consuming process, to be sure, but you need to place whatever you're writing in context, listening to that context and allowing it to help balance and establish that foundation through which the actual story will come forth. That takes some time. Again, it's a listening process, allowing that voice to come through always. So for me, it's always been that sort of a reflective process. And once it's together, it's almost like a passion, a frenzy, that the actual writing part just sort of bubbles forth. This book was a short in its duration in preparation. It was long in its duration in preparation. This is a culmination of over 20 years of working with Indian peoples, but it's specifically the culmination of basically 6 months of working with the Coeur d'Alenes at another level. But in either case, listening. And once we were at that point, we knew we were at that point, the writing process, and it just almost like a passion came out, and day and night, 3 o'clock in the morning, this phrase would come to me. Oh, I hadn't been thinking it that way. And writing it down, and when I woke up in the morning, that next morning, yes, that's where it goes. It's as if Jeanne, you know much better than I do, but for a man, it's almost like giving birth. It's already formed. There's a life here, and it's allowing it to come forth and nurture in its own way, and just getting away, and just letting it happen, getting out of its way so it can happen in that sort of way. That's the best I can explain it. But it really is a matter ultimately of listening.
We could even extend that further, when you talked about how long you had worked with different Indian tribes in that process, but the stories themselves go back for hundreds and thousands of years. So actually you must have a great feeling, as some of the others, the elders of the tribes, that they put in writing for preservation something that's developed over a very long time.
Well, and that took a lot of trust on a lot of people's parts, a lot of risk-taking. I mean, these are stories that have always been here. They were here before there were human peoples here. They were in the land. Coyote brought these stories here when he came up the Columbia River. Salmon brought these stories. They were already here to be discovered. These are sacred stories. These are most cherished stories. They're the heart and soul. People live by these stories. And to be able to enter into that sort of understanding clearly, and then having the trust, people giving both ways, to be able then to put these in writing, which is very risky business. This is very risky business, because there's been so many abuses in the past. So many people have opened up their hearts and have shared, only to be betrayed in the end. And so it took a long process, a trusting process, because these are such cherished stories. And it is amazing, that continuity. There are several stories here that we see that were recorded around the turn of this century, and they're still being told with as much vitality in life today as they were 90 and 100 years ago, without change. And I suspect 100 years from now, these same stories will still be told this way, because they reflect something very, very deep in the soul of people, and with their heart, and with this land. And so they are very, very ancient. They're part of this land. And I think that was the exciting thing about this book, because there are certain stories that cannot be shared. They're too private, they're too sacred. And for these stories here, working with Lawrence Arepa of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and Tom Yellowtail of the Crow tribe in particular, I've been their students. This is their book. This is their book. You know, to trust in this process to bring forth their stories. They wanted these stories shared because they are stories of this land, to be shared widely, so all the children, the Indian children, the non-Indian children, can learn of this place and have a better relationship with each other and, again, this land, because of the importance of these stories.
Jeanne Givens.
Tony mentioned that these stories are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. In creating the Indian identity, the storytelling is definitely a piece and a part of who the Indian is, and that is much different than contemporary American non-Indian society. The stories hold real religious and social functions, and what I'd like for you to explain to our viewers is more of your learning of why these stories exist, why they are told over and over again. What is the original function of these stories, especially for young children?
Yeah, well, it's a very challenging question. It's a very pivotal question, Jeannie, because it really goes to the heart of these stories, and a lot of misunderstandings, I think, that non-Indians have had of this vast and important literature. Just to backtrack, just very briefly, if I could, I came to this particular book as a result of working on our school district's Language Arts Curriculum Committee. We were in a K-8 adoption. Books were coming forward for us to be considered for our language arts classes in our school district. And some of the buzzwords were authentic literature and multicultural literature. And sitting on that committee, I was amazed at the beauty at which some of the materials, printed materials representing Indian stories and folklore were coming across. But it concerned me that the stories themselves didn't have that heart. Most of them were written by non-Indian peoples. Most of them were sort of compromised to reflect European ideas and sensibilities, and they spoke to our kids very directly, very accessible. But I was wondering where the voice came from originally. And so I went to the Coeur d'Alene tribe and said, well, let's have some of your literature in our school district. And again, very cautiously, they put me through a process of listening to their heart, their soul, so the stories could be brought forth. I think that's the key here, is just, again, that listening, that sensitivity to where these stories come from more than anything else.
In a tribal society, the stories have a purpose, and the purpose is to teach young children.
Yes. And in that sense, how are the stories going to be used then? How were they used, and how are they used? If we trying to present this literature, and we thoroughly did throughout, trying to present it from the perspective of the storytellers, from the Indian perspective. Again, that was the original motivation for this, of listening to that voice. How were the stories being used traditionally? There is the understanding, for example, that these stories were here at the beginning of time. They preceded the coming of human peoples, always. They're here. There's also the understanding of the power of language itself to be creative, to help create the world. The Crow phrase, dashushua, refers to this idea of breaking with the mouth. That which comes through the mouth has a power to affect the world. Sacred stories such as these, most of the time told in the winter, often in conjunction with the winter dances, the jump dances, the most sacred dances the peoples here. When those stories are told, they're told of what? Told of Coyote coming upriver and transforming the world, taking care of this monster and that monster, all in what purpose? Of preparing the world for the coming of human peoples, and then ultimately creating human peoples. With that understanding in mind, why the stories were told, I think in a very real sense, is to help create the world, is to help integrate each of us into our understanding of our role in the world. Because in the stories, like Lawrence Arepa says, this is our textbook. Everything is here in the stories. And we learn from our stories. They define who we are as a people and all that we can become. They're in the stories. So if the stories are told in this sort of sacred way, they help integrate each of us into our relationship and role with the land, the water, and each other in a very fundamental way. Certainly on a very overt level, the stories teach. They teach us about our relationships and our, what is good, what is bad, what's not to be done. Coyote is a great one for showing us not to do this and not to do that, but he also has good lessons for us as well. But to learn those moral lessons, to be able to laugh and cry. There's a whole tone that's in the stories that couldn't otherwise be conveyed. But I think ultimately the stories, and listening to the elders and working with them over the number of years I have, it's to integrate, it's to help create and perpetuate the world, like you would in dance, like you would in song, like you would in art. Through the symbolism of those expressions and the power of the word in story is to help create the world. When the story of salmon is told every year, When his story is told, the salmon will come upriver. I think it was Vic Charlot, Bitterroot Salish man, said it best. We are the stories we tell. If we cease telling the stories, we lose everything. We're not defined. There may be a physical body, but who we are spiritually, culturally, who we want to become, that's in the story. It defines the world. And hence the title of our book here, Stories That Make the World. They help create it, help create us and our relationships and the world around us. So I think that in a very fundamental way is why the stories were told, to perpetuate ourselves, to define ourselves, to give us our morality, our values. They're in the stories. And also, always, to allow us to laugh. You know it's an Indian story. Absolutely know it's an Indian story if there's going to be some humor there. There's always a laughter. As Vic Charlot says, the laughter allows us to lighten our load and makes the stories so much more accessible, too.
That was quite eloquent, to say the least, about explaining the whole process of a story. I had a question that relates to that. Two really questions that are quite different. One is that as I look at this book and I see the cover, and it's very blue, and it involves Lake Coeur d'Alene, and I want you to tell the story of how you selected this cover and how it relates to particularly Lawrence Aripia. We wish he could have been here today, and we thought he was going to be. He's just such a remarkable man. But would you describe that for us?
Well, Tony, I don't know how these things happen in the greater scheme of things. I really, truly don't. I cannot even see myself as an author, as an editor of a book. So these bigger questions that you tap into are just beyond me sometimes. But in the short run, let me explain and tell this story. I had prepared many of the photographs for this book, feeling that the stories refer to the land. The stories come out of the land. Places are named. Basil White tells a wonderful story of Kootenai Lake and the monster that lives there, the monster that was at Nelson, and all these locations. When Lawrence tells his stories, his Coeur d'Alene stories, everything is described. The landscape comes alive. Post Falls, Spokane Falls, this butte, this ridge, everything's alive. So we needed to photograph, we needed to give some visual images for those readers and listeners of these stories that may otherwise not know the landscape. So I was taking photographs that would fit into the stories. I was waiting for an osprey to land in Coeur d'Alene Lake here, waiting for it to land, waiting and waiting. And in my impatience, decided to take a little photograph of some waves hitting the reeds along the bank here. Well, when the photos were developed, none of which included an osprey, I liked the photograph. It was interesting. And so I included it with the others that I sent to publisher, not thinking much about it, and certainly that it probably would be rejected. Well, for some strange reason, again, I don't know why, they included it here. And we were wondering how they were going to put together the cover. I didn't know. I didn't have any suggestions because the content didn't lend itself to maybe a photograph of one of the storytellers. I didn't know. Well, they came up with this cover, this jacket to the book, and it's perfect. It's very subtle, and it speaks to lines, verses of the story, and it speaks to something that has become very blue. And one of the pivotal stories in the book that Lawrence Aripia shares is a story of Coyote and the rock. And in that story, the rock is moving about, causing all this mischief and destruction, and the people have come to Coyote to have him save them. And in his cunning and abilities is able to divert the rock from them, chasing him, going through a patch of huckleberries, getting all blue, and rolling eventually into the lake, creating the blue that's in Lake Coeur d'Alene, Benewall Lake, you see. And so, again, I'm not sure it was understood by the designers of the jacket that this is so symbolic, but there is our blue book.
And some things just fit together without a design or plan.
Absolutely.
My second question that deals with the content of this book, although we're going to get into that next week, the actual stories, but all the years that you've had this rich experience with the Coeur d'Alenes and the Crow and other tribes, Kootenai, and heard so many stories, you've already indicated that some stories are very private and are not published. Others can be, but they're all sacred. From listening to all the stories and having the opportunity to have choices, wasn't that also another task of this book? How did you choose, in cooperation with the elders, which ones would be placed in the book?
Exactly. And again, that was a choice that the elders made, always. They were, in working with Tom Yellowtail, for example, over 20 years, I had heard these stories shared many, many times before. And it was in the summer of 1993 that he asked me out. He wanted 4 particular stories, dear to his heart, included here, because he wanted them to be shared widely. And so always, in Lawrence's case, the same thing. I'd worked with Lawrence for several years and several stories. And in each case, the storyteller reviewed the textbook, looked over the stories, what was written, to make sure it met with their satisfaction, because again, they're the authors of this book in its ultimate sense. And Lawrence said, well, there's one story's missing here. And so we told the story of Coyote and the woman creating Post Falls and Spokane Falls, which also is very appropriate because we tell one of the early stories of Coyote releasing a salmon at Celilo Falls, which is an early story in that whole cycle of Coyote stories. And typically this story of Coyote creating Post Falls and Spokane Falls for the peoples here is the last story of Coyote, because he's killed afterwards. He dies to become something else. So it's kind of an interesting death. But so always the selection came from the storytellers themselves. And that kind of brings up another point. One of the things we really wrestled with regard to this book, how do we present the stories? Often you'll see the stories presented as prose, a nice story, we're used to that. But we really wanted to retain some of the voice of Lawrence and Tom in the speaking of these stories. So we selected sort of a poetic style, if you will. So you get a sense of the rhythm and the pacing. When the stories are transcribed from audio tape, as many of them are, we emphasize certain intonation patterns, pauses, hand gesturings, facial expressions, all that contextual material to allow the story to come forth. And as we stress early on in the book, in fact, it's best not even to read these stories, but to have someone read them aloud to you, because it's in accessing it through the voice and the hearing of it that the meaning of it is so much clearly retained. In fact, the stories are meant to be told in the company of many people. This is a collective event, not a private, personal event, but always something to be shared. And listening to the local traditions. In the case of the Crow tradition, they really caution people not to share Coyote stories during the summer months. Wait till that first frost in the fall, and then in the first thunder in the spring. So always listening to the sensitivity. Again, retaining that voice, and that's part of that selection process of what stories to include and not to include here.
Thank you. Jeanne Givens.
Most of the Indian stories have a lot to do with the animal world, and please explain to our viewers why so much of the Indian identity in terms of defining who we are and saying who we are and knowing who we are is encompassed by the activities of the animals.
Oh, I mean, it came out very clear in working with these elders that those animals are not animals, they're animal people. Mm-hmm. And you often hear that association of people there. Salmon people, coyote people, buffalo people, fish people, bird people. It comes out in the literature that there's a definite kinship there. And when you see many of there's 2 major genres of oral stories here, what are called myths, dealing with the myth people, not an illusion or a falsity, true stories. Stories of creation, of coyote coming upriver, of salmon, of grizzly bear, of the swallowing monster, of preparing the world for the coming of human peoples. And then what are called tales that involve human peoples after their creation by coyote, that are often interacting with animal peoples. There's a wonderful story in here, for example, of an elk visiting a young man, and that elk speaking to the young man and coming to him as a vision, through a vision as a guardian spirit, but understanding the important fundamental relationship that the elk is as a kinsperson to that young man, and what happens when that trust, that relationship breaks down. Mm-hmm. But then always to be entered into with respect. I mean, there's a small comment in here talking about a story when Lawrence's grandmother would go and gather cedar for a basket. What's the first thing she would do? She would offer a prayer to the cedar tree, asking its permission, addressing it as a being to be respected as a person, always to be respected as a person. One thing we tried to do here is always place the stories in context. And so we have discussion of some of the worldview values and key literary motifs that are in the literature itself. And we talk about those sorts of values and themes that you see in the literature, again, to help place that. And that's such a pivotal one, Jeannie. That's such a pivotal one.
You often hear Native people, when they get together, Indian people, if they're speaking, especially spiritually, they will say, my brother, the elk,
Yes.
my sister,
Yeah.
the fish, my aunt, my grandfather, the cedar. It's more than just an inanimate object.
Oh,
It is.
absolutely.
It is who I am, who allows me to live.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Along that line, in the modern technical world we live with so much machinery and fast-paced and so forth, much of this literature certainly has not had the kind of domination in that world. Do you think a book like this, is that another reason that you would think that it would make such contributions to get people to stand back and think about their oftentimes lack of harmony with nature?
Well, certainly the lessons are here if one chooses to listen. I hope that those lessons are clearly conveyed in the stories. That was the intent of the elders. I mean, these stories were always carried forth in this fashion for the children, always for the future generations. And the value and power of that understanding of a harmonious relationship. I mean, obviously, in the modern literature today, there's sort of romanticism of the American Indian. And I don't want to play that in its wrong direction, to be sure, but in these stories, regardless of what has been talked about, it is definitely here. It's not cliche, but there certainly is an understanding of a harmonious relationship with nature and all things, starting first within oneself. Many of the stories not only deal with the animal peoples and our relationship with them, but also internally. There's a wonderful story called Burnt Face in here, of just dealing with your own internal harmony. And when that harmony is maintained, the harmony with all those around it is also maintained. So many of these stories speak to multiple levels of that sort of harmonious relationship that you speak of.
I have a signal. We have less than a minute, and it brought to my mind, however, that it would be wonderful to have, along with this book, audio or video in which the elders, such as Lawrence Aripio, could accompany this. Maybe that'll be something in the future.
It would be.
I'm out of time. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry, but I have good news for our viewers, Rodney and Jeannie. We will continue this discussion next week when we will look inside the book, Stories That Make the World, and have Rodney Fry to tell us some of these wonderful stories that these elders have told. I would like to invite you to be with us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are pleased to welcome you back to the part 2 of a two-part series of the subject, oral literature of the Indian people of the Northwest. For our viewers who were not with us last week, we were very pleased to have on the program Dr. Rodney Fry, who is the editor of a book entitled Stories That Make the World, that deals with this oral literature. In program number 1, we discussed how the book came about and the very, very laborious process of how these very, very special sacred stories were chosen, and just the whole history of the book. In program number 2, we're very pleased to get into the content of some of these stories from the Coeur d'Alenes and the Crow and other tribes here in the inland Northwest. Dr. Fry holds a doctorate degree in the field of anthropology, and he's the director of the extended programs in Coeur d'Alene for Lewis and Clark State College from Lewiston, Idaho. And Dr. Fry has been with us on other occasions for other books that he's either edited or written. And Dr. Fry, it's a pleasure to have you back for part 2. We were so excited with the passion that you had last week for this work and what it does for our people in being able to share these stories. And please, we want to thank you for that time that you're taking.
It's a pleasure being here again.
And I'm so pleased to have on the panel Jeanne Givens, who is a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and she also is the vice chair of the Board of Trustees at North Idaho College. She writes the column for the Idaho Statesman for our viewers who are not in that area, and also she serves on some national commissions and boards, including those that deal with American Indian issues. And I should add also she's a former state legislator. And at this time I'll ask Jeanne Givens to commence our questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Rodney, when people hear stories, when they hear these stories, they often say, oh, that's such a wonderful story. I wish I had that story on audio tape so I could hear it over and over again. Why would that not be a good thing?
Good question, Jeanne. Before I answer it, let me just mention one thing on this show. I'd like to dedicate it in memory of Tom Yellowtail and Maury Waters, two of the elders that have worked with me very closely, and also to Lawrence Arepa and his fine efforts and as one of the main teachers of all of us and his stories in this book here, and wish they could be with us. But I need to kind of dedicate that to them, because they're truly the authors of the book here. We are in an age in which we have tremendous advantages that come from many forms of technology, and we want to take advantage of those forms of technology. The other day I was in my office on the World Wide Web, and I was looking under Indian oral literature, and there is literature on the web now that you can access. And certainly these stories lend themselves to being recorded, both in audio and videotape, and it does certainly lend itself to a better communication and retention of what occurred. Our intent here, though, was a little different. We chose not to put that material in that format, opting instead to encourage the listeners and readers of this book to take the stories here and to be able to feel comfortable presenting them themselves, so that their voice can carry forth the life of these stories. These stories are meant to be told. They have to be told. Their life is dependent upon them being shared with each other, because they refer to the land here throughout Idaho and Washington and Canada, Montana. They refer to this place, and they're only alive when they're activated by the voice of people. So we talk about techniques of storytelling in the book to help bring that out, to help the reader become a storyteller and access the stories in that way. And so if you simply record a story and rely upon a recording, it doesn't carry it that next step to make it very inclusive, to make it very participatory. Storytelling, if you look at all the techniques of storytellers, inevitably draw one important conclusion. The storyteller tries to transform the listener into an active participant within the story. All the techniques focus on that ultimate endeavor. To simply watch passively a story unfold through a video recording or audio recording, isn't that sort of, it undermines that participatory element that you have to live a story.
And it undermines the responsibility of the listener.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. You have to take an active role in helping that story unfold. The analogy that you see a lot of the elders talk traditionally about storytelling, it was like a canoe, and you had to paddle the canoe, and everyone had to paddle the canoe, because in the canoe being the story, you would visualize, you would explore your territory through the power of your story. But it took everyone paddling, and electronic means, you put a motor on that boat, you no longer have to paddle, and something's missing in a vital way from that storytelling then.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that certainly is a great analogy to explain why that it is in written form. I've asked our staff to put up on the monitor in a moment some photographs. We want to show about 4 photographs that have a relationship to the book, and I believe some of those we have not told our viewers yet that there are photographs in the book. At this time, I'd ask the staff to put the first photograph up, and if you would, Rodney, explain to us what this particular one is about and how it relates to the book that's entitled Stories That Make the World.
Sure, Tony. We tried to select visuals that would complement the stories, that would help give definition and allow the imagination of the listener of the stories a place to anchor their visions. And this particular picture we're seeing here is a photograph from the State Historical Society in Idaho here from Kamiai called The Heart of the Monster. And this is when Coyote, this is a Nez Perce story in which Coyote is finally slain by the swallowing monster, is slain by Coyote, and the heart of the monster remains there. Again, it's just that the stories themselves come out of the landscape. They're part of the land. And you see, as you drive down any sort of interstate or highway, all story is around you. And this is part of that representation here.
So in addition to the word, some photographs, although the word is so powerful, just adds a certain component to your work.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
We'll ask the staff to put up photograph number 2, and you can describe that one for us also.
Many of the stories deal with Coyote going up the river. It's an important and vital cycle of stories told by the peoples of this region. And one of the beginning points is when Coyote frees the salmon at Celilo Falls. And this is a picture of Celilo Falls before the dams came in, about 1950. An important traditional site by Indian peoples for fishing the salmon, but also a very sacred place where Coyote had come to release the salmon that had been captured by the Swallow Sisters. So again, it's a mythic landscape that we see here. It's more than simply a physical place.
Before we're on the air, you indicated that there's some statistics about how there's been such a decrease in the salmon coming up. Could you quickly give us those numbers?
Well, I don't have an accurate description, but something like 40 to 50 million salmon had come up the Columbia River prior to the first treaties of 1855 that were entered into by the federal government with the tribes of the Columbia River. And today there's less than 2 million or so fish are coming up the Columbia, and sometimes less than that are actually getting to Redfish Lake in Idaho. So
it's a real change.
It's a real drastic
Here's our
change.
next photograph.
Another story has to do with what was called Burnt Face and his travels into the Bighorn Mountains, into Wyoming. It's a Crow story. And there is a moment in which Burnt Face lays out rocks at a very high pivotal point in the Bighorn Mountains. Those rocks can be seen today. It's the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. And the image of that, which was a gift to the sun, is the same image as if you were an eagle flying over, in this case, the Sundance Lodge. You would see a center point and the forks coming out like a wagon wheel, like a medicine wheel. The image of the Sundance Lodge, again, an extension of that very mythic place, that medicine wheel, which again has to do with that mythic understanding of our relationship with the world.
And I would assume that some of these photographs also have a very important relationship to paintings that were prior to even photography, and the same kind of message that came in that.
Absolutely.
And I also understand that you have taken a number of these photographs that one finds in your book.
Right. Yeah. We tried our hand at it.
Okay. I believe this next photograph will be our final one that we will be showing for our viewers, and you can explain.
The buffalo. As the salmon is the staff of life for many of the Indian peoples of the Columbia River region, going from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, up into Canada, even into Montana. The buffalo is that staff of life for many of the Plains people. And the book includes stories from the Plateau region, the river region, as well as the Northern Plains, and the buffalo very pivotal. But interestingly, this picture's reference to buffalo also links the Coeur d'Alene and the Crow Indians in a very fundamental way, because as we know, the Coeur d'Alenes would yearly go over the mountains and join up with their brothers, the Salish, Flathead Salish, and go buffalo hunting as part of what it would become, what it would take to become a human being, an adult. The children would leave, as they would say, the children would leave and come back as adults. And part of the buffalo hunt, again, the importance of the buffalo for all the tribes in the region.
I know Jeanne joins me in wanting to hear, and of course she's had a very rich culture in hearing this, and she may want to contribute too, but we'd promised our viewers that we would have some content. The table of contents indicates there's some beautiful stories in here. Lawrence Aripio from our own Coeur d'Alene tribe here has really contributed in a most significant way to this book and others. And again, we wish they could be here today to share the story themselves, but since that wasn't possible today, would you pick a story? I would hope one from the book and share it with our viewers so they get a sample of what the book is about.
Sure. Let me share a story that comes from Barnaby, a Kootenai. And this is a story that happened a long time ago. It was a story where Frog beat Antelope. Now Frog is chief of his village, and down the way there is Antelope, chief of his village, a fast runner. None have been faster than he. This day, Frog gathers up all his people. He says, "People, let's have a race. I'll race Antelope, and I'll beat Antelope." And they hear this, and no one has ever beaten Antelope. How can this be? How can this be? I've got an idea. I've got an idea. And he shares the idea with all his people of his village. This day I'll go to the chief of the Antelope. I'll see if he wants to race me. If he does, we'll bet all our things. Frog that day goes to that village. You know, the one I was telling you about, where Antelope lives. Antelope, chief of his people. "I've come to race you. I'll race you, and I'll beat you," Frog says. "Can't be, can't be. You can't do that." He laughs at Frog. "This is funny. I've come, and I'll bet all my belongings with you, all my blue belongings with you. It'll be easy, it'll be easy. I'll take them all, I'll take them all." Frog goes back to his people. They gather up all their things. They gather up all their blue things, and they go this way, down to where Antelope lives. They're there. And they lay out all their things. There's the race. There's the race course. There, over there. They'll run from here to here. Frog goes there with some of his men. They're there. He tells them, "On our way here to that village, here, I want you here. And by the way, a leap away, Frog, there. A leap away, there. Hide under the bush, all the way there." And the frogs, there. The chief of the frogs is in the village, and his people are there. And all the Antelope people are there. They're quick, they're fast. You know how fast they are. None have beat Antelope before. They're there. They make their bets. They bet big. They know they can easily beat Frog. They can easily beat Frog. They're there. Antelope, Frog. They start running. Antelope, he knows has no worry here. Has no worry. And Frog leaps. And then he's there. And then he's there. And then he's there. He's there. And Antelope starts running as fast as he can. Fast running. And Frog is there, coming back, here. And he's at the finish line. And poor Antelope is coming with his tongue hanging here. And he can barely make his way back over that finish line. And Frog is there, and he's not even panting. They make their exchanges, because that day, Frog beat Antelope. And that's the story of Frog beating Antelope.
That was most interesting. Jeanne Givens.
My question deals with what does it take to be a storyteller, and of course you have a lot of it. You need to have a good story, of course, but what else do you need?
The Crow term for storytelling, I believe it's pronounced Baijijiwau, retelling one's own. Yes, you have to have a good story, and you have to feel the story. It has to come out from you. You just can't take any stories. And traditionally we know that stories were like property. They were owned and could only be told by people who had the right to tell them. That was important. Maury Waters talks about that everyone told a story. And I think that is true. There are certain people who had the right to certain stories, and they would tell them at the winter jump dances, for example, and they would tell this story, and maybe because of their abilities, they had special abilities, that they could really draw the people in. But everyone, all of us, are really storytellers in a very fundamental way. So what does it take to be a good storyteller? I think a love of life, a love of conversation, a love of oneself and the stories. There are no particular recipes for a good storyteller. You know, in the book we talk about what storytellers do. If the storytelling is to continue, for example, there is no audience, but there are participants, and they have to acknowledge by giving the sign for yes periodically, or as the crows do, ah. And should those signs stop, or the ah stops, the story will cease. There's a dialogue going on. Certainly there's a use of intonation and pauses, facial expression. When Tom Yellowtail tells his stories, when he told his stories, he would augment the telling of it with a rich assortment of traditional hand sign language. And so you would hear the story, but you'd also see it. Lawrence really emphasizes his voice, intonation, and the voice of the grizzly bear and of Coyote. His voice changes. He really emphasizes, there's changes, but all point to one point of bringing the listeners in. If you really love the story and allow it to come forth, that story will speak to everyone. So I think we're all storytellers if we allow ourselves to ungo. Where it seems awkward, but I think it's oh so natural, ultimately.
Lawrence also uses his eyes. His eyes are so expressive as he's telling the story.
Yes.
And then he uses his hands in this way. If he says walking, it could be walking. And so you get a much larger picture as to what the person is doing.
It's so contextualized. When you look at the native languages before they were transcribed into English, for example, the Crow, total lack of function words, preposition, conjunctions, ands, ors, or buts, totally gone. How are those phonemes clustered together? They're clustered together because of the social context of listening. All of the listeners is part of it. The words are there. They're all there, but they're linked by us listening to it and being part of the story. It takes that full context of visual, of gesturing of the body and the hands, and of us being there to create a story, ultimately. And ultimately, it seems to me, all good storytellers remember their stories. They remember them. They're never memorized. Too rigid. It kills a story, to memorize a story. But to remember it, not changing it, keeping it intact, keeping its life intact, but allowing it to be adaptable to the audience, to being flexible, to breathing life back into it, not adding anything significant or deleting everything. You've got to keep it there. There's a sacred trust, but keeping it alive so that it's flexible with the listeners of that group that you're telling it then. So remembering the stories. Very powerful. I remember one time Maury Waters was telling a story. Another was telling a story and Maury was listening. She was listening to a Lakota story she had never heard before, 20 minutes in duration. The minute was over, she said, let's see if I've got it. Let's see if I can tell it with my heart. And right away, she told back the same story, remembered, not a memorization of it. There was something of her heart in the story now, little nuances that you could tell was Maury telling it, but she got it just like that. She remembered the story.
Heart or empathy.
Yes, you really feel it, yeah. You have to.
In responding to Jeanne's question, you indicated that there's some different techniques that different elders use in telling the stories. With this work and what you've put in this book, but also in other studies that you've done, as to content in stories from tribe to tribe, are there some themes or ideas that tend to be dominant in one tribe that's very different themes than another tribe?
There are many levels at which we need to appreciate stories. There are certainly unique stories among the Coeur d'Alene that are absolutely unshared by other peoples, that identify this as Coeur d'Alene, and that's important to the Coeur d'Alene people. But there's also another level in which there's a lot of sharing. For example, we find the trickster universal. He may come in the character of Raven on the northwest coast, Spider on the plains. Coyote is typical of its manifestation. He's always there. Or the orphan quest, the child that's bullied and abused, maybe scarred, and then is adopted by a guardian spirit, by an animal person. And the orphan status is overcome and the bully triumph. It's a Cinderella story, a dominant story in the literature as well. There are common themes like that. Maybe a result of sharing, but maybe a result of our common human experience as well. Or that they are simply here. The stories are here. So there are universal levels of shared themes in the stories, and there are uniquenesses too that define a Coeur d'Alene story. Coeur d'Alene stories are always anchored in this landscape, which would be the case. And they speak of this river or that ridge or this body of water. Here, the Crows, when Tom Yellowtail begins a story, he lays out the entire landscape before you. Before he even starts the story, every river that's in the territory, every mountain range has to be defined because you place the stories in their geographical context first. Very critical.
Another issue that we talked with Jeanne about before we did the program, that is how individuals and when you have individuals in any society, you have those who are very extroverted and those who are very shy, but they all have wisdom and have different ways of expressing themselves. Certainly the most well-known storytellers in the Crow tribe or the Coeur d'Alene are others. Is there something from childhood in which certain individuals emerge with the elders to be the storytellers? Why do some individuals become so renowned as the storyteller?
Well, I'm not sure if I can answer that question because some of the most powerful storytellers are the most introvert people that I know. Many of the extroverts are excellent storytellers and add a dynamic and an excitement to their telling that is unrivaled. But I'm thinking of Agnes Vanderburg, for example, an old Salish woman that passed away many years ago, Flathead woman. Oh, she was so quiet and gentle. But the power in her gentleness, when she spoke her words, it literally drew everyone into the story. Delivered. Again, Tom was the same way. And Lawrence, these aren't extroverts. These are very humble people. And they feel the weight of these stories on their shoulders and responsibility to carry them forth. And they're very, in that sense, very humble. But when it's almost a transformation. When I see Lawrence tell those stories, as if there's a spark in his eye and there's a life that comes forth, and he's defined by the telling of that story too. So I don't know if I could limit it, because I've seen power come from both the extrovert and the introvert.
Jeanne Givens.
Lawrence speaks of not an obligation or a responsibility, but he speaks of a noble duty. It is his job to share. And he sees it more as a Coeur d'Alene tribal trait of being a generous person.
Mm-hmm.
That's what generous people do, is that they share stories.
Mm-hmm.
And in watching Lawrence, he shared his stories with many non-Indians over and over again, and that's wonderful. Also, stories have usually a lot about food in them. Food and starvation and going without food, and several ways of saying, I'm hungry. They were starving. They didn't have any food, no fish, no salmon. They were hungry, and it just goes on to describe the hunger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah, and one of Coyote has a lot of peculiarities. He's never satisfied with his desire to get to know women and to have a good meal. So it comes out very strong in the Coyote stories as well.
In relation to, again, the content of the book, do you have a favorite story among all those? That's probably an unfair question. They're all very special to you. But
they certainly are.
Maybe I can ask another way to be a more fair question. That is, you've broken this into sections, and could you tell us why that is, does it lend itself to categories as relation to content?
Well, it doesn't. And we found, for example, that traditionally the stories were never titled. They were simply part of long cycles. When Lawrence, Clarence Woodcock, Ponderay from Flathead, remembers when his grandfather would tell the Coyote cycle. It would take him 3 full winter evenings to tell the cycle. He would tell it among other adults, and that was the cycle. 3 full, entire sunset to sunrise evenings, and the stories were never labeled. We've had to do that somewhat here. We've tried to identify a title for each of the stories and who the author is, and we've kind of broken it down into what are called myths, the sacred stories of the myth people, the transformation, and tales. We've talked about stories emphasizing certain cultural themes and literary motifs. We've presented some stories that can really help bring out the storytelling techniques and also the purposes of stories. That's somewhat arbitrary. We really wanted people simply to get into stories in that sense. It is a challenge, again, how we format those stories and to make sure that, again, our ultimate goal here was always to present as authentically the voice of the storyteller, but to do it in a way that would make it accessible for a large audience. And we've had to make compromises and really work with those two almost contradictory forces sometimes to really allow the voice to come through and not to compromise it, but to make it accessible to a wide audience, an audience based in literacy, based often in cultural values that are different than this literature. And to bridge that gap is really the challenge here.
So from last week's program, if we went back to that and talked about the putting the book together, that was another one of your challenges.
Oh, absolutely. And a key throughout, absolutely.
Jeanne Givens.
The book, I believe, is going to take off and fly. I'm sure it's popular regionally. What about royalties for the book?
Well, again, that's an easy answer because the authors are Lawrence and Tom, Maury Waters, Basil White. These are the authors, and all royalties for sale of book meager as they might be, will always go back to the storytellers. I mean, that's just a given. You know, it's just, in the case of Tom, where he's passed on, we're starting a small college fund at the Little Bighorn Community College that will go into for students to, you know, Crow students. Things like
And
that.
Mari's family.
Yeah, the same thing with the Nez-Perce, absolutely. Yeah.
I think that the exploitation of people taking stories, running with them, getting their PhDs, never returning to tribal communities to perpetuate the story. I think that you're so correct in that that tribes are now so much more protective of their stories.
Absolutely. And something has to be given back. I mean, we're all human members in this, and one of the great lessons I've always learned from Indian peoples is the importance of gift exchange and reciprocity. We never take, we always give, and give first. And in that giving relationship, we receive, but we have to give first. And hopefully we've given back in a good way, in a sincere way. What the Crows say, diagaji, doing it with determination, sincerity, and hopefully that this book reflects that.
On that note, I have to bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of Jeanne Givens and our staff of the North Idaho College Public Forum, Dr. Rodney Fry, we thank you for the 2 weeks you have spent with us and a really fascinating discussion of both how the book came together and the content. And we also want to give our very special thanks to the elders of the various tribes that were willing to share with our audience through this book. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we will turn to yet another subject that we think is of interest to you. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.